All right, thank you all. This morning's scripture is going to come from Luke 18. Luke 18, we'll read verses 10 through 14. It's a parable that you probably have heard, and it's a parable Jesus tells about the tax collector and the Pharisee. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up toward heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. May God add his own blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Well, to understand, just real quick to preface, as we go through Lent, season which began with Ash Wednesday this past week, I'm going to do a series of sermons each week of Lent on, I'll pick a different person. And kind of the theme is going from failure to faith. And this morning we're going to look at Matthew. Matthew, the disciple. Matthew was a tax collector. And to understand more about Matthew's situation, let's understand more about tax collectors in Bible times. We've talked about them a few times before. We'll get a little bit more detail, but not too much. The general idea is that a tax collector was looked upon by the community as one of the worst of sinners, maybe the worst of sinners. Now, we're not real fond of the IRS, right? We have kind of a love-hate relationship. We know they have a function, but if anybody ever has to deal with them, that's not a pleasant experience necessarily. So we have this kind of we understand that that's a part of the system and it's a part of our system, but it's a part of our system. See, the tax collectors in Jesus' day were not part of their system. It was part of the Roman system. They worked for the enemy. Remember, the Romans were occupying, they were an occupying force, an occupying army. They were the enemy. It wasn't like their own government was taxing for the purposes of keeping infrastructure up or providing for schools or the military that gives protection or all. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was to support the Romans and their projects and their administration. And the way the Romans did that was they basically bid out the taxes. If you're going to be a tax collector, this is what we need. This is what we get from this area in taxes, and so you pay us for it now, and then you go collect the tax. So think about that process. So I'm going to be a tax collector. I'm going to go to my enemy and say, I want to pay you for the privilege of taking people from my money, from my country, so you can have it. So if it's $1,000, we'll make up a number. It's $1,000. I paid them $1,000, and now I've got a year or a month or whatever the term. I didn't find the term, but whatever the term was, I've got that long to get my money back. And of course, I need to live, right? So I need to make a little profit. So I'm not just going to charge the people the tax that the Romans require. I'm going to overcharge them because I want my cut. Why would somebody do that? It's money, right? Greed. A quick way to get ahead. And maybe for some people that was more important than loyalty to God, loyalty to their own country. We've seen it. It shocks us when we see it. We don't understand it. We don't understand it, but we see it. Matthew was a tax collector. He went by the name of Levi. In Luke, they call him Levi. Later, he becomes Matthew. There's theories about that. We're not going to get all that today, but Matthew was a tax collector. He was probably a particular kind of tax collector that collected, basically it was a toll, like at a toll booth, but when people would transport goods to market, then they would have to go past certain places, and Matthew was in Capernaum, it would seem, and he was probably collecting a good on every time someone brought a load of goods into the town or out of the town, whatever. Anyway, he got the taxes on what they were carrying to bring to the market to sell. He was in a tax booth, or like a toll booth. Jesus saw him sitting there, and he says, I want you to follow me. And Matthew got up immediately and followed him. Interesting thought, isn't it? Here's Matthew. Why was he so quick to jump up and join Jesus' movement? If we take a look at the story of Zacchaeus as a kind of a linchpin, or maybe a benchmark's a better word for understanding this, what we see is Zacchaeus, remember the story, even the song tells the story really pretty good, doesn't it? He was a wee little man, remember, and a wee little man was he. And so he climbed a tree, right? So he could see better when Jesus came to town. Now read that story really carefully, and you find out Zacchaeus didn't just climb a tree, he went ahead of the crowd. He went ahead of the crowd. He got away from the crowd. And my mind works like this. When I try to imagine being Zacchaeus, I try to imagine his thoughts and what he was trying to accomplish and his feelings. And I'm thinking, and when I do that, I think, here's this guy that he's been ostracized by his own people. He has no place to go, really. He lives there, but he's got nobody. Think about how you would treat somebody who is giving money, taking your money forcibly, or with the help of a ruling force, to give to a terrorist organization so they could come right back and dominate your own community. That person is going to be they're going to live in a pretty cold world, aren't they? And I would guess that there's at some point that person looks back and says, man, I was impulsive, or I didn't understand what I was doing, or it hasn't been worth it, or whatever. But we aren't built to live alone. And I think Zacchaeus wanted back in, but he can't just stand with the crowd. He goes ahead. And you know what? If Jesus was coming, now think about this. If Jesus was really coming, would you really be anxious to see him? Or would you almost be afraid to see him? I mean, he knows. He knows more than Santa Claus. He knows hearts. He knows what really goes on in your mind. Do we really want to stand before that? Are we really prepared for that? I think Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, but he kind of doesn't want Jesus to see him, maybe. Kind of that fear, that desire to stand before him, that fear, afraid. So he climbs the tree. Now, this is all interpretive, all right? This is me trying to put myself in Zacchaeus' shoes. He climbs the tree to kind of see Jesus, but not be seen. But then Jesus says, come on down, and Zacchaeus is eager. I think he's ready for a way back in. I'm going to that to say I think the same thing is true of Matthew. Now, what did we just mention here? Matthew's got to pay in advance for the right to collect taxes. He's got to pay the tax to the Romans. He's got to make that money up. But when Jesus comes and says, Matthew, I want you to come follow me, be my disciple. Boom, he's up like a shot immediately. He says, okay, I'm in. He left money on the table. He left money behind. Eager. He's ready to return to the fold. And Jesus just offered him a place to belong. And he took it. If you read a little further on, you find out, I know Matthew, he throws a big party for Jesus and some folks, and the Pharisees get really upset. You know, you're partying with sinners. You're spending time with sinners, with the bad sort of people. In a rabbinic writing from ancient times, and they talked about tax collectors. They put it this way: they call them robbers, prostitutes, and tax collectors. I mean, these are the bad people. These are the worst people. And they look at Jesus and say, this is where you're spending your time with? What are you doing? And then, of course, Jesus says, well, the doctor helps people who are sick, not the ones that are well. I'm here to help the people that need help. Of course, the Pharisees don't go in for that very well. And here we are. now with the idea that Jesus parable. Here's this tax collector in the temple. Now, if you can remember diagrams that you've seen of the temple, maybe you'll be able to picture some of this. Or the temple is a whole courtyard, has a series of spaces, really, more than places, spaces. It has huge, large courtyards, the court of the Gentiles. Those were people who had been converted to Judaism, were not born as Jews. And that large courtyard that's still there when you look at it's a form of it, it's been rebuilt, but it was that large open area that you see if you watch the news or TV shows sometimes, the big open space. That's the court of the Gentiles. And then there's a smaller, which you don't see anymore, but there's a smaller enclosed space. There's a building within this space, a smaller courtyard, and that was divided into two. The first part of that was the court of the women, and the next was the court of the Jews. If you could, and so these are still outside. Then you had the court of the priests that went inside the building. So the publican is going to be in this area, this open area next to the building. Probably he would likely have been born a Jew. He would have been, and especially if the Pharisees next to him in the same space. So he's in that court of the Jews, and he's standing far off. He's standing away from everybody else, which we'd expect now that we know more about what a tax collector is. And he's beating his chest in humility. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This is a really powerful image to me. This man has ostracized himself from his community. He has sought to further himself personally through greed and betrayal. But here he is on this day, standing before God, asking for forgiveness, realizing who and what he is, not hiding from it, but opening himself in confession. And the Pharisee, who can see him, probably standing much more in plain view. Pharisees love to be noticed for their faith and their piety. Saying, God, thank you. Thank you for making me somebody who's not like that. I'm not like all those other sinners. I'm not like that tax collector. I fast twice a week. I follow the laws. I don't break the commandments. I tithe. I tithe my income. That's on top of what the Romans required. Pretty tough to be faithful to all the laws in those days. Almost impossible, really, to really get them right. This Pharisee, here's the odd thing. This is the flip side of the story. He's the guy we want to be like. This is the guy that goes to church. We'll update the terminology. This is the guy that goes to church, who puts his 10% in a plate every week, who serves on the different committees, who does everything he can to help the people around him. And he's really proud of that. He lives his life by comparing his righteousness to the level of other people's. He judges these people. Are they as good as me or not? He wants to be the best person he can be. And he knows that way is to follow the law and to make sure he's as good as he can be. He does that not by comparing his life to the law as much as how well he follows it to compare to somebody else. He judges. He judges. That's a trap for us in this world. I think it's a trap for us in our culture. We are always so much about being the strongest, the fastest, the best, the quickest, the most, the tallest, the smartest, whatever it is. And the way to find that out is by comparing how we do to other people, isn't it? Who makes the most money? Who drives the nicest car? Who has the best job? Who has the most influence? Politicians play these games all the time. Kids play them in the playground. It's kind of built into us. So part of the ways we determine leadership, who's most able to do it. And it's not always about ability. But the publican, the tax collector, publican, same thing, he stands in humility. Have mercy. Greed can be monetary, obviously, but greed can also be about our souls. Greedy to be more righteous than somebody else. Desiring stature and status. I won't go into all this history at all, but there were heresies and misbeliefs in Christian faith as we were developing our faith. Gnosticism is one of the most commonly heard of. It was one of those where the more you knew, the more revelation you had from the Spirit, the more you knew that other people didn't, the more status you had. And it was a very strange kind of twist on Christian faith, and it never lasted, thank goodness, because it was crazy. But it was about stature, and that's about comparing. So Jesus says, which one of these two men left justified, cleansed, made whole? Which one received God's mercy? One who admitted that he needed it, or one who believed he'd made it on his own? Big twist, because of course the Pharisee was that was the good guy. That was the good guy. Who has a better chance of getting into heaven? The good, solid church member, or the guy who's in jail for robbing a bank? Say, well, on the surface, you'd say the church member, right? But where's the heart? Well, only God knows that. We don't have room to make that decision. All we know is that God loves his people, all his people. And he sent Jesus for all his people, publicans and Pharisees, prisoners and church folks, Christians and Muslims. What we can't lose sight of the fact is by approaching God with humility, seeking the grace and the resurrection power of Jesus, that's the only way we have. The only way God has really made available for ultimate salvation. When we, in this time of Lent, examine our lives, that's the point I wish for us to think about. Am I sincere in my humility before God? Do I compare myself to other people? Or do I really try to see them with the eyes of God himself? Do I really try to allow God's Spirit to help me understand the people before me? So that I don't judge, but so that I love. Boy, the power of that. Zacchaeus came back and said, I'm giving this much money. I'm giving it all back plus more. He guaranteed himself a life of poverty in order to make up for what he had done. Matthew leaves his deal on the table and walks away from it to follow Jesus. And they could not wait to receive this grace. How many times have we hungered for that grace in our own lives? How many times have we had an opportunity to offer that grace to someone else? Did we offer it, or do we pass by it because we're better than they are? Very, very hard question. Very personal question. And yet one I think we have to deal with in our lives in order to grow in our faith. Deal with it remembering Jesus loves you. And his forgiveness is real. And his desire for you is real. And nothing is strong enough to pull that gift, that love, away from our lives.